Good day, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this panel discussion dedicated to energy and geopolitics. We have an amazing panel with us today. Energy is the lifeblood of our modern civilization. It powers our homes, it fuels our vehicles, it drives our industries, but the way we produce and we consume energy is rapidly changing, and these changing are having profound impacts on the geopolitical landscape that we're looking at. We're going to speak about a lot of issues. We're going to speak about the major upheavals that are reshaping the energy space. We're going to speak about energy security, which drives us all around. We're going to discuss our energy choices and how they lie at the heart of the climate change crisis, and how the transition to renewables is not just about changing power sources, it's about our commitment to our planet's future. So today, our experts on the panel will help us delve into these critical issues. We're going to illuminate the intricate links between energy, between geopolitics, and between climate change. And without further ado, let us dive right into it. I'm going to start by introducing briefly my fellow panelists. Starting to my right, to my left actually, Mr. Cyril Svoboda is a prominent Czech politician and diplomat. He served, among others, as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2002 to 2006, and he currently serves as the president of the Diplomatic Academy of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. To his left, Mr. Norbert Röttgen is a long-standing parliamentarian, first elected to the German Bundestag in 1994. He's currently a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Might I add that from 2009 to 2012, you also served as Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. To his left, Ms. Leila Benali is the Moroccan Minister of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development. You've been in office since 2021. Ms. Benali brings over 20 years of experience in strategy, in finance, in engineering, and has worked, among others, for the Cambridge Energy Research Associates, for Saudi Aramco, and as well as for Apicorp. To his left, to her left, Mr. Joseph Muscat is a long-standing public officer as well, first elected as Member of Parliament of the Republic of Malta back in 2004. Joseph later held one of the highest public offices in his country, serving as Prime Minister of Malta from 2013 to 2020. Mr. Ibrahim Matola is the current Minister of Energy of Malawi since 2022. You served in that same role under President Banda from 2012 to 2014, and bring experience as a parliamentarian, having served as Member of Parliament from 2004 to 2009. Last but not least, Mrs. Ellen Paith-Leibson is the Director of the International Security Program at the Shah School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Ellen previously had a 25-year career in government, serving among others in the National Intelligence Council, in the State Department, and in the National Security Council. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. I want to start our discussion with a rapid poll. We are representatives from such a diverse group of geographies. We have representatives from Europe, we have representatives from North America, we have representatives from the African continent. I would just like to hear in a nutshell, what has been the biggest disruptor for you in the energy space in the past 10 years, and why? I'd like to start to my left, Cyril, with you, if you may.
Thank you. So the energy is a weapon today. It's a weapon, political weapon, mainly in Europe. You know, my country, like the other countries, but my country, we depended on the Russian gas from maybe 96%. Nearly all the gas in the Czech Republic was from Russia. And when Russia opened the war against Ukraine, we decided to reduce the import of Russian gas, and now we have zero gas coming from Russia. And the problem is mainly for my country, and we are happy for being inside EU because EU is a power which is fully respected. But we are now seeking the right diversification of the delivery of energy. And from this point of view, it is very important to be here in Morocco and being here in Africa, because there are some new opportunities mainly for my country and for European countries, because we are to start a negotiation with, for example, with Senegal, Angola, Nigeria, and Algeria, and it is a tough job. Even it is a tough job for my country. So you can imagine that my prime minister, he wanted to visit Nigeria, and the very same day when he wanted to enter the territory, the Nigeria said, no, we have not ready to secure or to secure your stay, and we are not capable of performing your program. It was very strange political position, but it happened. So we have to perceive the question from the political point of view, because maybe there are some players who are very influential, and maybe they influence also the Nigeria not to welcome the Czech Prime Minister. So that's why we need to understand better each other. I mean, Africa and Europe. In Europe, we do not understand maybe all the processes which are in Africa. But it is very, very urgent today to diversify these resources. And very last sentence, I'm now stopping because not to speak too much. I am also against stopping delivery of gas from Russia, because no one knows what will happen within 10 years or 15 years. No one knows. So that's why I am for diversification, but not stopping the delivery from Russia.
Cyril, you answered a question that I did not ask, though. I wanted to know what, in your opinion, has been the biggest disruptor in the energy space in the past 10 years, though I hear from your concerns and from what you expressed that ultimately it was the realization that came out of the Ukraine war conflict, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll take that with. I'll pass it on to you, Norbert.
Of course, the same, and everybody knows that particularly Germany, as the largest economy within the European Union, was over-dependent on Russian energy, both gas and oil. I've always fought against that. I've always warned against the weaponization of energy. I was an opponent of Nord Stream 2. But nevertheless, even for me, it was a disruption. And even I, so far, had not argued and made the case that we must not take any Russian gas or oil, but not that much. This was my position. For the future, we have to discuss. It depends on, of course, the political development, particularly of Russia. But the major impact is that the German energy conception, our transition, there was a bridge as an integral part of our concept. And this bridge was gas, which shall lead us into the renewable age. Of course, you need time for doing that, and this bridge was destroyed immediately with the war Putin and Russia started against Ukraine. May I just add another upheaval in my personal biography? When this was the COP, the United Nations Climate COP in Copenhagen, which was a complete failure. And I was the German environment minister, who then was in charge of renewable energy and climate, appointed only a few months before. And the environment and climate ministers were broadly quite optimistic before the conference. And then it turned out we had not understood the geopolitical dimension of climate and energy and renewable energy policy, and this was the reason why the big players, China and America and India, they were simply not ready and not prepared to strike any deal because of the geopolitical and economic implications of that. And this was a personal, not only a personal, it was only, of course, a political catastrophe, but this was a backlash in our efforts to forge a global consensus on our path of the global community, the international community towards the renewable age, and it turned out it will be much, much harder. It will take longer than our planet demands that we have to be.
Thank you. Leila, same question to you. Seen from Morocco, the biggest upheaval in the past 10 years in the energy space?
Right, and since I have to say something different than my predecessors, and this is a panel, I would just say that anyone who spent time in the security or energy space would tell you that the answer is no. The geopolitical premium and the geopolitical weight in the energy sector, there's nothing different in the last 10 years than after the world wars, or the 70s crisis, or after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the 2003 crisis, 2003 war in Iraq, or the 2008 financial crisis. I think the last 10 years brought something much more different than that, which is underinvestment. And this crisis of fear that makes capital flows not flow into the right places. And for the energy space, I think that was the biggest disruptor, because you had something called globalization that enabled us to decrease the costs of renewables and at a higher pace than actually other fuels or technologies. But at the same time, the energy sector witnessed multiple years of underinvestment, particularly after 2014. So today, the world indeed isn't realizing geopolitical crisis, climate crisis, a post-pandemic difficult recovery in some areas, in many areas of the world, while at the same time we didn't channel enough investments. And why is that? Also because we have a crisis of debt. 250 or 260% of global GDP today is debt. So in a way, this is, I think, is what is very different today compared to the previous decades. And since His Excellency has mentioned his own experience as being a lonely Minister of Environment and Renewable Energy at one COP, I will raise another COP, Glasgow. I was appointed by His Majesty, the King, may God assist him, 3 weeks before Glasgow. And we had no gas in the system that morning when I had to go on stage in Glasgow and put our hand on our chest and swear that we will move away from coal and not build any new coal plant. But I didn't have gas in my system that morning because Algeria cut the gas to Europe, and Morocco being a transit country. So we had our own gas crisis 4 or 5 months before Russia got into Ukraine. So I think the same stories are being repeated again and again over the decades. But today we are having an issue with underinvestment in our ability to structure projects and strategies in a way that makes them bankable and making sure that those capital are flowing to the right places. When I say capital, it's of course a debt, equity, incentives. We have something called the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We have the European Green Deal. Morocco was the first country to sign a Green Deal with Europe. So all that has to come into place and be viewed in a very integrated way if we want to tackle the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you. At the risk of being unfair, I'm going to ask my last three panelists to what started as a poll took a bit longer than I expected. Joseph, from your perspective, and as you've seen this and largely in office over the past decades, for you, with the particular challenge of being an island state, the biggest challenge you faced from an energy standpoint over the past 10 years?
Okay, I'll answer also your first question. I think that the biggest disruption came from a policy perspective, with energy being increasingly weaponized. I believe that today, if we look at the security landscape, there are three major weapons. The first is the US dollar. The second is the energy sector. Only the third is the nuclear bomb. And probably and truly the third, and hopefully, will never be used again, but the first two are being actively used. So I think that's the biggest disruptor from a policy perspective. The flip side of that is that from the market perspective, there has been no disruption over the past decade, really and truly, because the same market mechanisms have been in place. And if we look at the price of energy, really and truly, in Europe, in most of countries in Europe, but not only in Europe, the biggest issue is not the producers, but it's the connectivity, it's the transit. And most of the money goes really and truly there. So if we think of disruption, we haven't seen anything in the market. We haven't seen the Spotify, Booking.com, the Ryanair of this world, simply and truly that is sustainable. So we have seen a policy disruption, but not a market disruption.
Ibrahim, seen from Malawi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. I'm coming from sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the southern part of Africa, where Malawi is a land-linked country. In the east, bordering Mozambique. In the west, bordering Zambia. And in the north, bordering Tanzania. Being a country highly dependent on hydropower plants. That's the source of the energy in the southern part of Africa. But also being the biggest part of Africa consuming the oil and gases, where the source and the producers, in brief, just to say, the supply chain has got a lot of challenges for that oil and gas to reach to the customers, the recipient countries, the states. There are two aspects on your question. First is the natural disasters. As I've said, that we depend a lot on hydropower, the issues of deforestation, the low levels of water in the rivers, but also in the oceans, and the natural disasters which, starting from Cyclone Gombe, Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Anna, and this year we had Cyclone Freddy, which was very, very terrible. As a country, Malawi, last year, on the 24th of January, due to Cyclone Anna, we lost 130 megawatts of hydropower plant. The dike was washed away due to the storm. And it is a month ago when His Excellency, the State President, Dr. Lazarus Makathi Chakwera, wanted to walk the talk by decommissioning the gensets which were being run by Agreco, 78 megawatts. And then a month later, that's when we lost 130. A country which has got 545 megawatts on the grid. And you lose 78 plus 130. You make your calculations, you see how much do we have left on the grid. With that challenge, in the sea, the supply chain, there are a lot of disruptions. Hence, we have demurrage, logistic challenges. Malawi uses 3 ports. The first port is in Mozambique, Maputo. And the distance from Maputo to Malawi is almost 900 kilometers. And we transport the oil and gases through trucks. The second port is in the eastern part of Mozambique, where there are also challenges of conflicts within the member state, Cabo Delgado. And the distance to Malawi is 700 kilometers. The other port, which was designed by the Pan-Africans, may their souls rest in peace, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda of Malawi.
Ibrahim, I must stop you there. What I take away from the challenges you've mentioned, grid stability, the disasters also caused partly by climate change, and how systemic they can be for a country like Malawi, which has limited production capability, or at least very systemic production capabilities. Am I right in summarizing this that way? Wonderful. Elle, just passing the word to you, and then before we deep dive into the topics individually.
Thank you. So I think, objectively speaking, the interruption of Russia as an energy supplier is the big story. But just to diversify your list, if I might, why don't we put nuclear energy on the list as well? It's just a little bit over a decade that Japan experienced the triple disaster that included the meltdown of the Daiichi nuclear plant, and we saw a global shiver over whether nuclear energy was still viable and could you guarantee safety of nuclear energy. No country is entirely dependent on nuclear energy, but we did see Korea and Japan both had national policy decisions about whether to suspend nuclear energy as one of their objectives. And during the Ukraine war, we've seen the danger of a huge nuclear power plant being also weaponized by the conditions of the war. So I just want to put that on the list as something that we might consider of whether the mix, as we imagine a world where everybody believes in diversifying their energy sources, where does nuclear fit? The environmental community, of course, is a little bit skeptical about whether nuclear energy is a green energy or not. So I just want to add that to your list.
Thank you. I want to start among the many topics that were raised with the rise in renewable energy that we've witnessed over the past 10 years, which to me is one of the biggest systemic changes that has happened in the way we produce and procure energy. Norbert, can we start with you? How is renewable energy changing the way that we look at energy security?
in very different ways. In very different ways. I would say the one angle of looking at energy security from this perspective of renewable energy is, and on the aspect of energy security, is that we have learned that if we continue to use fossil fuel as our energy base, we would put humanity and this planet at risk. So the starting point for the transformation into a renewable energy system is energy security, because fossil fuel-based energy system is not secure. It's totally insecure because it puts human life at a risk. So this is the starting point. However, if you really accept this, and I think it has been globally accepted by now, belatedly, unfortunately, but it has accepted, then you have to do an you are faced with an unprecedented challenge to fundamentally transform a system which is of fundamental importance for any economy, for human life as well. And the transformation of a system, of course, is a risky thing. And what our challenge is to accomplish this challenge of the transformation of the system in order to save the living conditions for human beings on this planet, we have to be quick because we are late. Earth warming is going on and continuing to happen. And at the same time, we have this, notwithstanding the complexity, to do it in a way that people feel safe all through the decades-long process of this transition. And this is a big challenge because you have to replace the sources of energy production. You have to replace the infrastructure, the transportation of energy, to bring it from the place of production to the consumer. And you have to replace the market and legal system for a new system, because renewable energy requires, for example, hydrogen requires different market mechanisms and different legal frameworks for the development of the new renewable energy sources. So this is a huge challenge, and it's a fundamental requirement, because this transition will only become a success if trust is secured over the period of this transition. If we were to fail with having a secure energy supply all over the time, we would lose trust and we would jeopardize the entire effort and task.
Leila, do you share that view? And I was going to ask you specifically, Morocco has an ambitious renewable strategy as well. I believe you're aiming to have a 50% share of renewables by 2030. Morocco has a wind strategy. It's going to bring a couple of large PV power plants on the market soon. It aims to be a major player in the hydrogen space. Are, in your perspective, renewable energy the key of country's future energy security?
That's a slightly different question than you asked before. Yeah, no, I think I will share a lot of what has been said, in the sense that we see it every day that we are trying to solve using, again, I think the whole world has realized that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and renewables cannot do it alone. And you will need a basket of technologies to be able to do that. And the reason for that is very simple, is because we are trying to cover 21st century demand and consumption, 21st century, and I think there's a cat moaning just before. 21st, we're trying to solve 21st century challenges and demand and energy consumption and utility using 19th century fuels and trying to move away from those 19th century fuels and using an infrastructure that took us most of the 20th century to build. And of course, it's a challenge, but I would want to use one word that was used before in the previous question, which is connectivity. And I think one powerful value proposition that renewables brought us is this realization that we cannot do it if we don't invest in connectivity and in the grids. Again, we realized, Morocco, the US, France, Asia, Asian countries, African countries, we realized that we invested in grids. And we as politicians or constituents or NGOs are trying to electrify our utilization of energy as fast as we can and making sure that renewables and nuclear and maybe other technologies that are zero carbon have a wider space of that market share. But the issue is, if you look at the history of energy transitions, there are actually only 2 technologies and fuels that gained market share, global energy market share in less than 10 years, 10% of the global market share in less than 10 years. That's renewable energy and nuclear. And those 2 fuels and technologies were the ones that benefited from some sort of heavy subsidies, one way or the other. Incentives, R&D subsidies, or alike. Some sort of taxpayer government money. So today, unless we have a very honest and frank conversation about this transition and what it entails, and making sure that we take into account the fact that, yes, I mean, renewables are largely intermittent. I mean, apart from the great hydro potential that you have in Malawi, most of the time, solar and wind would require some serious storage capacity. And with that storage capacity will have to be invested in, taking into account all these changing technologies that are competing with each other. So I think today, the beauty of the renewables is that it gets us to realize that we need to invest more in connectivity and grids, seriously. And if you take Morocco, you mentioned a couple of numbers that we have. It's true that we are reaching 52% of our electricity capacity based on renewables before 2030. And in our NDC, we have to reach 82% of renewable capacity in our system by 2050. But that also entails that we have to multiply the pace of annual investments in the energy transition space by 5 annually starting this year. So in the grid, we were injecting roughly less than $100 million per year over the last decade. We have to reach $500 million per year invested just in grids and storage to ensure that we make space for renewables. And we know that. We have already communicated on that. Now, we really have to be serious about it.
You were saying before that one of the biggest challenges you see is the lack of debt capital to finance these investments. Where do you see the solution, and how does that fit into Morocco's strategy?
Well, I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to cannibalize my fellow speakers' time. I think two very quick answers. The first one is the very fancy word that you hear in every energy finance conference, which is blended finance, and making sure that you have a combination of equity and debt and innovative instruments to ensure that you make sure that the risk is balanced. I don't want to say de-risk, but at least the risk is balanced between the different stakeholders. The other aspect that I would say is much more important than that is what we discussed early on, which is trust. And how do we do it in Morocco to build that trust is to ensure that we have a very clear vision as long as possible, and making sure that our partners at the government, in the government and private sector, have a very clear view of the balance and of opportunities that we have. So for example, in the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, I was going around with a QR code that people were where people could actually read in 3 minutes what is our energy transition strategy and what sort of business opportunities, investment opportunities we have going from the large PV, CSP projects that you mentioned, the 800 to 500 megawatts projects, into smaller circular economy or waste management, waste valorization and recovery projects that we have in different parts of the country. And mind you, we want to use the reconstruction of the Haut region after the terrible earthquake that we faced to actually demonstrate the validity of these new types of business models where our partners, and this morning when I was in Casablanca, I actually just signed a part grant, part debt offer from the Korean government to help us demonstrate that with $1.5 million we can bring in storage, solar PV, and a number of facilities to those villages so that we build back better. We build back making sure that those solutions are efficient, but also cost-wise very efficient.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joseph, can you share your perspective on how small nations like Malta can navigate those changes in the global energy landscape? We spoke about the fact that connectivity was going to be a topic, that investments in the grid are going to be a topic, that diversification is going to be a topic. I can imagine for a nation with the geographic specifics like yours, it must be quite a challenge.
It is a challenge, but it can be overcome with, participation by the private sector, participation by the state. I totally agree with what Minister Bernali was saying, that at the end of the day, the state needs to be there in order to give the necessary incentives and security also for the private sector to invest, especially in technologies and areas where the market argument is not there, clear and present from day one. So if you ask me about my country, I believe that our biggest challenge when it comes to this policy area is actually water management, where being an island and being one of the very first countries in the world after Israel and Australia to introduce desalination plants, 50% of our water necessities come from the sea, desalination. That necessitates a huge degree of energy. So one of the most important commodities to humankind is dependent on the price of energy for us. But apart from that brings me to my second point. I'm all of an advocate for transition to renewables. I believe that this is the present and the future. I agree with what His Excellency was saying on the problem that surfaced, that LNG is considered in a controversial manner, and it's not seen as a transition sort of phase between conventional fossil fuel and renewables. I believe that LNG is a crucial element of all this. But to me, the most important point when discussing transition, there is one single word that is neglected most of the time. That is just transition. Thinking as policymakers that we can just flip from one side to another and having people pay, and most of the time it's the most vulnerable in society that have to pay for such changes. I think is a gift to populists. It gives a scenario where populists are able to say, you see, the renewables are making you pay more for your energy bills. It's these blessed environmentalists, when it's not the case. So in the transition, the word just, a just transition needs to be there that protects those most vulnerable in society.
What can be done to enforce that social justice in that transition, to not play into the populists, as you say? What can be the role of the state?
That's the role of the state. So we cannot, I'm a social democrat, but I totally don't agree with the idea of just taxing multinationals and taxing companies just until they bleed. I think that the role of the state should be there to make sure that where the market mechanism doesn't work, it comes in order to protect those most in need. And this is where I think that the European Union managed, I believe, the shock of COVID very handsomely, where it managed to not get engulfed in its bureaucracies of state aid and so on. But this is what I believe is the way forward, being more flexible in the way we approach state aid, being more, more open in the way we see the role of the state. And it's not state against market. I think the two can cohabit very well together.
I want to get back for 1 second on the geopolitics of energy. With these whole ideas that were put on the table, diversification, Cyril, how is this going to influence the weight and the political influence of traditional fuel exporting countries, which for a number of our countries have been one of the bedrocks of our diplomatic policy?
Yes, you raise an extremely important question. We do understand that the renewable energy is a future, so that's obvious. Maybe with the only exception, maybe we disagree with our colleague, is the question of nuclear energy. But I don't know if it is the same in Germany or in Malta, but in my country, it is a hot potato. The politicians, some they voted for Green Deal, but being at home, they are saying we stop Green Deal, we stop all the commitments which are incorporated in the conventions, because we are to protect our national interest. And even today, we are before the election to the European Parliament. Some influential parties in my country, they are now printed the slogans and the posters, we stop. So these ideas coming from Brussels. So how to solve the problem? I think that the very important point is that it is up to the political elite to say yes, we do support, despite all the consequences, despite the price, notwithstanding with the problems which are linked with this strategy. But I'm afraid that even in my country, maybe it's the same in Malta, I don't know, so we are speaking about the commitment to stop the production of the cars, of fossil fuels by 2035. And the politicians are saying in my country, yes, it is written, but it will be not the case. So if we want to change the mentality, and if we want to be successful, I think that we need to encourage mainly the political elite to be open, to be strict, and to say, yes, we do support. Fortunately for my country, we are de facto the part of the German economy. So in the very end, we will follow the German economy. But I'm speaking about the atmosphere in Europe. We spoke about Malta. Malta, yes. So there's a question of voting in the European Council, in the councils of European Union. So it is really, it's a hot potato today because the populism is now prevailing over the rationalism on the political scene. So that's the global problem.
Thank you. Ellen, maybe the same question I wanted to ask you, sort of seen from the other side of the Atlantic. How are these changes going to change the weight and influence of traditional fuel exporting countries? The United States has built a strong part of its foreign policy on energy security and its relationships with energy exporting countries. A US shale gas revolution has taken place, and new renewables energy are being built out. How do you see this impacting the relative importance of fuel export producing countries?
Thanks. Thanks. So a first point to make would be that energy security is not the same thing as energy self-sufficiency. It does not mean that we are completely cutting off all energy-related trade. So I do think the United States is achieving some level of net self-sufficiency, but it is both exporting and importing. Early on, maybe less than a decade ago, there was this perception that because of the shale breakthrough, if you will, or the recognition that the U.S. could actually produce a lot of fracking, could develop fracking as a major component of our energy, people jumped to the conclusion that therefore meant the United States didn't need the Arab Gulf countries anymore, and that we could fundamentally turn our backs on the Arab oil producers. And I always found that a very rough, oversimplified judgment, that energy is never the sole factor in a relationship when you're a global power like the United States, that energy may be a very important component of how we see countries that are both, that are helpful or not helpful to world peace and security, but energy is rarely the exclusive topic on the agenda. So I think people tended to overstate the significance of that the U.S. would somehow shed some of its past partners because it was achieving some level of self-sufficiency in energy. Unfortunately, I think energy is a little bit tied up with domestic politics in the United States, and it's a piece of the culture wars that we have between the two extremes of our political spectrum. And people are either wildly enthusiastic about fracking, or they are worried that we have not yet built a safety and regulatory infrastructure to determine whether there are long-term hazards, long-term risks to it. So I think, over time it will settle down, and I think the United States very much embraces the idea of energy diversification. And energy will almost certainly still be a topic in some of our relations with key energy producers, but not necessarily the only thing that shapes those relationships. I think obviously between the Abraham Accords and now this tragic war in Gaza, obviously our commitments in the Middle East are for more than just energy purposes. So.
Thank you for putting this idea on the table that self-sufficiency is not the same thing as security. I think it's a very powerful idea. Maybe that has failed to be picked up in that clarity. I think it's one that I wanted to pick up with you, Norbert, in the experience that Germany has had over the past 3 years, where its security was greatly impacted by the consequences of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. How have you been rethinking Germany's energy policy in terms of defining that line, security versus independence, energy independence?
Yeah, we have made the experience of being dependent, and that dependency materializes when it comes to a political or geopolitical conflict. So just to mention, because you didn't ask for that, we should keep in mind our experience with our energy dependence from Russia when it comes to an increasing energy supply power by China, both in terms of raw materials and technologies. So if we were only to continue our path, then we were to see another monopolist, or let's put it that way, or a German and European dependence, partly an international dependence, on the superpower of both energy raw materials and energy technologies. So we should keep that in mind, and we should learn the lesson from what we have experienced for the future. So what we have experienced is that the political conflict brought about market distortion. Of course, we had I wouldn't say that we had a situation where we lacked energy security. There were fears, of course, but we were able to put a lot of money, in order to support citizens as a consequence of the energy crisis we had, because there was a fallout of energy supply, gas and oil supply, quite immediately. And we had to buy from the market to a high price, and we still have to pay an extraordinary high price, which is a big challenge, bordering to a real obstacle for big major parts of the German industry to remain competitive because of high energy costs and low energy costs and subsidies of energy, like the IRA in America and the United States, to remain competitive as a company which is exporting and wants to stay and wants to locate in Germany. So this really has brought, and it's not solved yet, has brought the economic competitiveness, the cost competitiveness of major parts of the German industry under big stress. So what is our consequence? That we have to push forward quicker than we intended to do in order to make this transformation and transition, which has new opportunities because the geopolitical landscape is changing. Morocco is becoming extremely important for us as a producer, a very cost-competitive producer, even more so in the future, of course, of green hydrogen. And we will have new partnerships and new relationships substituting the old fossil relationships we were dependent and relying on, and this will more and more transform into new relationships which have requirements in production, in transportation, and for that in financing, which are not there yet, but we are consistently and strongly pushing for this transition to take place conceptually and much quicker than we even intended to do that. So we are under pressure with high costs, but there is no way back. But the solution, the path forward, is to be more determined and smarter in realizing what is necessary, and this is this transformation to happen, make it happen.
Thank you. So, in terms of lessons learned, this is what you would keep.
So I think the dependency lesson is not learned yet, because we can see the increasing dominance of China, as I outlined, and we haven't despite the experience, we are not really learning. We are talking about de-risking, but we haven't started to do it, because also de-risking means that it comes at a cost in the short term, because you have to pay to preserve your long-term sovereignty and security. So we have not learned that. And the other lesson, I think this is a consensus in our society, but what Joseph said is of course extremely important. This is a transition which is not inherently a growth story from the start, but the revenue comes with a delay of perhaps a decade or so. And in the meantime, you have to preserve political broad support, and you have to subsidize and you have to invest and subsidize also the consumers, because the transformation of system comes at a cost. It's expensive. And this is the political challenge, a technological challenge, and the challenge to preserve acceptance and trust while doing it.
Ibrahim, when you hear this, these takeaways, these experiences that have been made, that have just been mentioned, what takeaways do you have for Malawi, and how does Malawi look at this line of security versus self-sufficiency in the particular context it's in?
From Malawi's perspective, it is very challenging, especially the lessons learned during the COVID-19, where the movement of goods, services, but also human capital. In Malawi, the energy sector is going through the reforms. And one of the reforms is to embrace the independent power producers, but also to bring in the green energy. However, because of the manufacturing is not within the economic zone, it becomes very challenging in order to access the components of these green energy. When you look also about the tariff, it's not what we are advocating for when we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, the affordability, sustainability, and reliability. I would like to thank what Ben Ali, Your Excellency, has mentioned and alluded to, that we have gone into these new technologies, but with challenges. The fluctuation of power with the solar, where we appreciate that Africa has got abundant resources on sunlight, but also the wind. But when we feed into our grid, there is a fluctuation of power. I'll give you an example what happened in last April in Malawi. Because we have injected 80 megawatts of solar without battery storage. And one morning, woke up with the intermittent of power. And just imagine, at a central hospital in the capital city of Malawi, women who went into the theater to give life to an engineer, a president, member of parliament, a councillor, a doctor, a professor, they didn't come out. All of them who went there, they died. Children who were in incubators, I witnessed myself. Because when you are Minister of Energy, everybody thinks you are an angel, you can solve their problems when there is intermittent of power. I went to the pediatric and I found more than 35 children in incubators. And the hospital didn't have even the standby genset. So all of them, 35 children who were incubators, they didn't see life. All of them died. So these new technologies, when we are bringing into our systems, we need also to have some backup system so that we can have what we are calling affordable energy, sustainable energy, and reliable energy. So when we are talking about the sustainable goals, yes, we are there. But as African countries, especially from sub-Saharan Africa, we are very good in signing the declaration, the commitments which are being set by the developing countries. So we end up going into this, but we need to be given time. In short, we can say that we need to move together without leaving anybody behind. This journey needs to be worked together. When you leave us behind, we'll follow you. Then there will be the problem of immigration from Africa into Europe and the other parts of the world, seeking for green pastures. Energy is the driver of the economy. Once energy is there, industrialization will be available in the African countries. And once we have industries, then the job creation will be there. And when we look at access rates of electricity in our countries, although we have embraced in a lot of programs, but we are still very low. And we are talking about 2030, accessibility of electricity should be 100%. And we have signed back in our mind, knowing that 2030 is just around the corner, it's tomorrow. And it is impossible. But what we need is support.
Ibrahim, what shape would that support take? I think you've put your finger, first of all, thank you for that very personal testimony that you gave, which I think highlights again the importance of energy security and what it can mean at an individual level. You said some countries are very good on signing documents and strategies, but then it's the implementation that is difficult. You mentioned the imperative to leave no one behind. What steps can be set concretely to make that happen?
First is that we cannot just leave the issues of energy security in the hands of the private sector. Government has to play a bigger role because we're looking after the population, not looking only on a business model. For that, I would like to call upon the finances to look into this and invest a lot in the energy sector, the way they have been investing in the health, education. So once we invest a lot in the energy sector, some of these things will fall in line, because you cannot put in a hospital in the rural area where there is no refrigerator for the vaccines. We need to make sure that there is power in the rural area. So we have embraced on off-grids, and these off-grids solutions needs more financing. And I would like to call upon the financiers to come and support. When they are supporting health sector, they should know that first should be the energy sector, because they will need power. When they're investing in education, it is not justice. Where a child who is learning under kerosene, studying under kerosene, and a child who is studying under LED lamp, the performance will not be the same. This child is inhaling the soup and then end having a nation which is not productive because of pulmonary diseases. And the most affected are girls and women who are spending most of the time in the kitchen. We need to save girls and our women who are spending a lot of time in the kitchen. Let's not look only on cancer, but these diseases which are affecting most of our young girls and women. So financing is very, very important.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for that. Financing, and I think you mentioned one important aspect, which is commitment to whatever is decided and commitment to seeing that transition through. Leila, I want to ask you, the international framework, the Paris Agreement, international climate commitments are encouraging nations to transition to low carbon technologies. But it's also creating a lot of tension about the finances, as Ibrahim mentioned, about the pace. What can we do to make sure that everyone feels committed to those targets and to their pace?
That's a very broad question, but very timely, because we are just 2 weeks away from COP28, where there's a lot of expectations on the credibility of the multilateral system. And I think that's rule number one, particularly as we are looking into how the multilateral system and the Bretton Woods institution, being financial international institutions, the multilateral development banks, but also the UN system as a whole, has responded to the various crises, including the political crisis, but also, of course, the climate crisis. And it's very, again, I cannot agree more with what Norbert was saying when he was talking about Morocco. And it's true that from our standpoint, it took us a few decades to build. The third key pillar of our energy strategy is regional integration of electricity markets, gas markets, carbon markets. And when we reversed the Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline, I remember one European foreign minister telling me, well, I fully get it. I fully understand what you guys are doing. With optionality comes a lot of empowerment. And this sentence stays with me all the time, because the reason why we are building what we are doing is the fact that we are the only African country interconnected with Europe, gas-wise, electricity-wise, logistically and culturally, and bidirectionally is very important in our energy strategy. So when it comes to our discussions on COP, I think the two things that we bring into the table. First, Morocco is a president of the United Nations Assembly for the Environment. And one of the things that we realize is that those issues in the multilateral system are being discussed in silos. And I will take advantage of the fact that we are in MEDays to say a couple of words on that. You cannot handle environment, biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate in different rooms. We are the same people, it's the same environment, with the same planet, so we cannot have multiple conventions. I mean, you can have multiple conventions, you just have to make sure that the multilateral system is bringing some integration in that. So I think at UNEA, we are making sure that in February, when we all gather in Kenya, we have all the multilateral environmental agreements are at least having a day where they convene together. Because at the end of the day, we are all, as politicians, fixated, trying to solve a multi-generational issue while helping our populations finish the month. And for some of us, while helping the populations to survive in an incubator. So I think this gives you the type of tensions that you have when you are coming as a politician in the multilateral system as it stands today. So that's why I think the first key thing that I would launch in this MEDays Forum is to ensure that we regain the credibility of the multilateral system and the multilateral tools that we have. Because beyond that, I mean, we are talking about people dying today. There are also some questions that humanity has never thought of. Like, for example, as in our UN discussions, we realized that 25% of UN membership is going to disappear before the end of the century. And you're going to have UN members, some islands, I mean, you can tell me that some remote islands, but still, these are raising questions, especially those disappearing by 2040 or 2050. We're not talking about adaptation versus mitigation. We are talking about clear migration, sovereignty, and identity issues that humanity never had to face and doesn't have the answers unless we ensure that the multilateral system that we built in the 20th century reforms itself and get into those questions right away, while helping, of course, our populations to finish the week, the month, or at least the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Joseph, my fear is that, I think Leila started to put this on the map, is that there's going to be a new, we're all in this together, and there's going to be a new conflictuality around our ability or not to manage these tasks together. Is this a fear that you share or not? And how can we raise to the challenge collectively?
Well, I think it's not a fear, it's a reality, in the sense that I remember quite clearly, so my country is part also of the Commonwealth. So I remember quite clearly chairing the Commonwealth meeting, and we had unanimity -1, bar 1, on the COP commitments, simply because we were not all at on the same page, and we're all defending our so-called national interest. And this is not, you know, I don't think we should be in any way shying away from that sort of argument. So let's take what Norbert was saying some time before in a very diplomatic way. So the over-reliance on China on energy products, let's call a spade a spade. The global drive, including in Europe, towards electric vehicles will divest Europe from one of its only areas of industrial superiority and basically give its keys to its main competitor and make it totally dependent on that, unless we see the transition to electric vehicles, which does not solve the issue of emissions and so on, because if you plug in your car to charge and the charge is coming from a coal power station, you're just shifting the pollution. You're not doing anything to remove the pollution. So the only way of seeing this is as a transition technology to hydrogen, which is obvious, but not enough is being invested in this sector. Obviously, I was in the European Council at the time. All those arguing, you know, to be careful on the transition to electric vehicles were labeled as, you know, anti-environmentalists or in the pockets of car manufacturers, when actually now it's becoming mainstream, the idea, you know, maybe we rushed a little bit too much and we did not see not only the strategic connotation, but we actually might have made things worse for the environment itself. So I think that this realism that I think Leila said it quite clearly, you know, we have never faced these issues before. So I think we should not be ashamed of saying, you know, we made mistakes and revising our the way we look at things, because at the end of the day, it's human lives. I was extremely touched by what His Excellency was saying about his visits to hospitals. I can assure him that these are experiences that even European countries went through on being off the grid for some time over the past summer. We did not have the tragedies that you're saying. To me, it's shivering. If I will take away one thing, it's not a policy perspective or anything. It's what the story you just said. 35 babies in incubators dead. That's, to me, where we need to get together, not devolve all our energy on numbers and figures and long-term perspectives, but seeing that these things don't happen.
And yet, and maybe to start bringing our discussion to an end, coming together, I'm just taking one example on how I see geopolitics in opposition to that. With climate change, the ice melting in the Arctic Sea, opening new areas for oil and gas exploration, leading to territorial disputes, to obvious environmental concerns about those carbon bombs being exploited. How can we see a positive note to this? How does this work with us coming together behind this common goal? Cyril, I wanted to ask you.
The question, if I am capable of giving you a clear answer, but I am stressing the framework. It's, in my view, it's very, very crucial, because one day in Europe we want to create a single energy market. This is the only way how to solve it. So it is not a dream, it is a task. It's a homework. Of course, because we will be taught that there are some other countries which are polluting the environment, China, the other countries. But we are in Europe to be a leading continent. So, despite the fact that we are too far from the north of our planet, or from the south, from the ice, but that's a political responsibility, and in my view, the framework is absolutely crucial. So to respect the commitments we sign, and to create a new framework inside Europe, and to be a leading continent.
Norbert, maybe to build on that idea, where do you see reasons to be optimistic that we're able to put this common framework together?
I think it's quite realistic that we are going to see quite an acceleration of the experience of what Earth warming means. You can even feel and see and experience it in the center of Europe, so in the northern part of our globe. So I think people will more and more feel and see that the disastrous consequences are not that far away. So this will trigger a change in behavior. As it was with Russia and the war, and it was immediately clear, over a weekend, we will have to fundamentally change our energy supply system. So this will not go over a weekend, but it will be quicker than expected. Then I have trust in our engineers, in our scientists, and in the technological innovation process which is going on. In a decade, the costs of green hydrogen production in Morocco will have significantly decreased. and with the technological improvement and innovation, of course, renewable energy and the transportation system coming along with it, renewable energies are unbeatable, absolutely unbeatable. It's the cheapest and most secure way of producing energy. And there are enough countries that are determined to go ahead and will reap the fruits. So it will become an economic, a business, and a political competition. Who is first? Who will become first in this race? And this will give pressure, put pressure on the adaptation process. Yes, we are too slow. We are not on track. But these are several elements and features of the near future which can be depicted already today that provide for some optimism in this process.
I love your optimism, and yet how will the forerunners reap the fruits of what they've been doing when at the same time countries in the north are doing new drilling in the Arctic to get fossil fuels out?
I wouldn't say, so we have to be clear, we will not enter the renewable age tomorrow. So there is a bridge required, and the bridge will consist of fossil fuel for some time. You make me withdraw from the optimism. But today we have 80% non-renewable energy production worldwide, 80%. So you can't propose in a 5 years' time we will come to zero. So it will take time. And this combination of we see what will happen if we don't adapt, technological innovation, so there are so many young people who are with passion and competence working on that. And the new race has already started. Germany will become and is a competitor in that. Morocco is becoming a competitor. So this is a new economic era with new actors and old actors, of course, clinging to the privileges and the power which the old age brought with them. But they are definitely, over time, the losers, and the future is for those who are preparing for the future.
And who are moving forward. I think that takes us to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for having partaken in it. Thank you so much for having been in the audience and followed us today. Have a good... We have to bring the panel to an end, but of course feel free to join us on stage and continue the discussion here.
Can we raise a question? It's possible?
So please, we've been signaled to end the panel.
It's very quick.
Okay, so we've been given actually 15 more minutes, so
okay, thank you.
By all means.
So I would like to...
Can I please ask you maybe to stand up, introduce yourself,
Unfortunately,
and
I have time restraints. I can't stay any longer. No, I have time constraints. I have another meeting where I have to go, and I'm 50 minutes late, so I can't stay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so 2 minutes.
I personally, I'm sorry for that.
The question is for you. So if you give me this chance...
Please respect it. I have just
the question is for you.
Yeah, I think my colleague will do this.
My name is Taufik Ben Jabara, and I am working in shipping in marine service. And my question is, it's about geopolitics, where there's some geography, some politics, and New World Order. We were, in the West, were facing the crisis with Russia since 2014. And so February was not really a surprise. And all the politicians from Europe, they were balancing between the war may happen again with Russia or not may happen with Russia. So this crisis for gas was kind of very rational, that we are now here into it. And maybe it's an opportunity, because it awake everybody to build a new future. But how can we reach what Senior Minister was asking for, this multilateral success in Kenya? If Europe are going in war against Russia, if we are cornerizing China for Taiwan, all that wars in the world, how can we bring everybody together?
You just don't see the world coming together, right? And you're more of the, how can we make this happen? Yeah. Can I ask Leila if you can offer us an answer to that?
Yeah, I'll try to give a very brief answer given the time limits that we have and answer on Norbert's behalf. He gave me his blessing to answer on his behalf. It's Germany and Morocco coming along. No, I think at the end of the day, I personally believe in the power of humanity to survive, at least in this century. If you remember, LNG was created to circumvent the geopolitical issues and the political issues that we have between neighbors. And I remember one of the very first LNG cargoes going from Qatar to Kuwait went through Sakhalin and came back. So I think the ability of humanity to create solutions that will enable us, and we talked a lot about hydrogen, and I really didn't want to make this panel about technologies or fuels or even finance. But I think if we are able to reach the economies of scale that will enable us to decrease costs, to find solutions, I think you are in the shipping sector from what I understand, make sure that we have those, if I take methanol, for example, one of the things that we are discussing at the European level is if you bring in carbon and hydrogen to create methanol, that carbon has to be biogenic. Well, in African countries, that might create a problem. That's one example where we need a more, I would say, flexible taxonomy to enable those technologies to be developed and make sure that, be sure that 80% of the technologies that will actually help us to survive in the futures do not exist today in the energy transition space. So I would definitely be very much optimistic about how technology, innovation, even the finance world will craft the solutions, but the politicians have to leave the space for the sector to develop, as I said, multi-generational and cross-border technology. So I think to answer a long story short, I'm pretty sure that we will find that we will survive in the end. It's just, I cannot describe the trajectory because the technologies do not, most of the technologies do not exist today. Of course, we are all betting on, like we bet on CSP versus PV in the past, like we bet on nuclear fusion at some point, like we are betting today on green hydrogen, bringing, solving hard-to-abate sectors. I think this is all a matter of bets and making sure that we have long-standing strategies that will enable us to reach that. But to get to making sure that, of course, I mean, and I relate to what Ellen was saying a bit early on, it's a little bit oversimplistic, and I would just say the simple answer would be just follow where the value chains are, rare earths, cobalt, lithium value chains, to see where the future geopolitical tensions and chips, to see where the future geopolitical tensions will be. But I think the answer is a bit more complex than that. And the reconfiguration of those value chains and those complex relationships will be there with us. And unless, at the end of the day, we put a cost on human life, and as the minister from Malawi was saying, the energy ministers and the defense ministers are the one at the end of the day who are handling that cost of life and cost of dignity in their equations. So I think I would not be as pessimistic as you try to put this panel on, because I think at the end of the day we will survive. Humanity has always survived.
And we have the creativity within us to solve any challenge. Ellen, can I offer you the word?
I thought we might, if we just focus at the maybe higher latitude of geopolitics, I thought we might take some comfort from the fact that when President Biden and President Xi met this week, climate change was on the agenda, and there was some perhaps vague language that they're both committed to finding some common ground. If the two largest economies in the world can, at the upcoming COP, establish some broad principles that would be responsibilities of the industrialized North as well as the global South, including language on the compensation fund for countries that are victims of climate change but not the perpetrators of it, that would represent at least an effort to trying to create more global consensus. I do think that how countries respond to climate change, whether they're seen as both responsible within their territory and good global citizens on climate, is going to become a new metric of how countries' national assets of power and influence in the world are measured. So I think countries countries think about their soft power. They think about their sources of legitimacy in the international community, and how they behave on climate change is going to be I think it's going to increasingly be one of the metrics that is used. So climate change is also going to determine who are the winners and losers in the international system. And so I think that there's a higher awareness of the geopolitical consequences and the geopolitical dynamics of climate change. And again, just to close, I think it will be interesting to watch the meeting in Dubai to see if, in fact, Biden and Xi have any new proposal to make or put on the table that might create a more positive energy at the upcoming COP. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take another question from the audience, if we have a microphone. Don't have a microphone? Maybe to the lady over there. Can I ask you in the same way to introduce yourself, who you direct your question to?
Sure. My name is Intisar. I'm a fresh graduate student in international relations. My question is for whomever wants to answer it. Given the fact that the energy transition is not going to be done tomorrow, and given the fact that COP28 is approaching, I'm very curious on your perspectives on climate justice and historical responsibility in the context of Africa and energy transition. Do you think that it's very important to take it into consideration in the process to ensure a successful energy transition, and most importantly, as you mentioned, when it comes to the multilateral agreements, do you think it's important to push more negotiations and more expertise in this area when it comes to meetings like the COP28 for the sake of Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're back at the social justice. I think, Ibrahim, it has your name on it. As you mentioned, I was going to start with Ibrahim because he made that point earlier.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, which is also very relevant, and it makes me to unpack what I have alluded to. As Ellen has said, that we are expecting in few weeks, I can say maybe 10 days from now or 2 weeks, where COP28 will bring some excitement and also new direction on how the polluters are going to make the commitments. And what we need is not only talk shows, but we need really commitments and the action. Action is very, very important. And as we are getting closer to 2030, we need action to be done from this COP 2028, so that those who are polluters and the compensations can be done to the end users who are being affected by the issues of climate change.
Thank you very much. We'll take one last question and then conclude the panel. To the gentleman in the front, please.
Hello, my name is El Hussein Ben Msoud. I'm a student at the University of Luxembourg. I'd like actually to ask two questions, one about global and then one about Morocco. So,
can I ask you to make it quick, please, because
yes,
we've been asked to conclude the session.
Yes. First, I thank His Majesty for his patronage of this think tank between generations and between people from different countries and continents. And the second, I would like us to ask all the panelists, do we need to make an international binding energy and food law so we can ensure that no country can or will misuse energy and food as a weaponizing or a warfare? So we can ensure stability in the world. And for the second question to Your Excellency Minister Ben Ali, I would like to ask as well, if do you have a strategy or policy in Africa under your ministership, under His Majesty the King, in regard to develop energy hub to ensure the intra-African energy transit, etc., such as we did in the food security in regard to phosphate in Nigeria and Ethiopia? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Should we take them one after the other? Maybe the first one on an international framework, tricky?
Yes. As I said, the international framework is highly needed, but we are in Africa. And Morocco is it's a lovely country, highly developed, rich, in good shape. But when you are visiting some other African countries, you can see such a deep gaps. And when you are visiting some countries, you can ask yourself, it is possible to change the style of living in those countries, including the problem of energy, because of many huge problems, because of insecurity, because of infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, because of many reasons. So that's why, in my view, Morocco, some other countries are playing very important role to deliver this message to the other African countries, to do something to make a huge progress. Because, you know, some European countries are accused for being former colonial powers. So any advice coming from France or from some other countries is not highly welcomed. And when I listened very carefully to the speech of Putin, he made this year, it was in March, he said, we are ready to help Africa, and we are not to give any advice to the African countries how to govern. So it's a strategy of Russia in some countries to say you are in power and we are not intervening with your domestic issues. So that's why I think that is a very tough job, and I think that Europe is to be leading continent, and you have a very strong responsibility for the rest of Africa, because Africa needs your message.
Leila, maybe one word on the institutional framework question against the weaponization of energy and food, if I understand you correctly.
I'll be very quick. I think to answer that question specifically, I think there's no question that earlier in this panel we talked a lot about fear and the fact that fear prevents capital to flow to the right place. There's also another aspect that we are tackling, and I think that relates to Morocco's strategy in Africa and Morocco's cooperation in Africa. It's dignity. And what was bearable, I would say, a couple of decades ago, what was totally unbearable a couple of decades ago is today becoming sort of bearable. And that's something that is very much concerning us. 600 million people in Africa who do not have access to electricity. I mean, you wonder. I mean, once I say the number, 20 years ago it used to shock. Today, it doesn't. It's just statistics. But you end up having babies dying in incubators. I mean, that's or babies dying or people dying. So I think when it comes to Morocco's triangular South-South and North-South cooperation, because again, it's very much linked to that. If I take the example of the Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline, yeah, I mean, it was launched by His Majesty the King Mohammed VI, God assist him, because he simply had a long-term vision. He wanted to contribute to the development and the empowerment of the populations in 13 countries. And making sure it's just, you should not see it as just another intercontinental gas pipeline. It's an empowering value proposition for 13 countries because it solves development issues, but it's also solved migration issues, because we talked a little bit about job creation, but we didn't talk about migration. So I think these aspects are very much interlinked, and they are very much intertwined with the third key pillar of our energy strategy, which is, as I mentioned earlier, regional cooperation.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you in the audience. Thank you for that. Have a good evening.